All right, we're going to jump into the 1900s and work our way towards World War I. And America sort of jumped into the 20th century, which is the early 1900s, with this sort of great excitement, great enthusiasm. The United States had grown to include 45 states. By 1900, population of the United States was 76 million people, which was about more than double than it had been at the end of the Civil War. The territory that the nation owned, which had been in 1800 about 800,000 square miles, was now over 3 million square miles. The increased production of American farms and factories had really helped make the United States become almost completely self-sufficient. The country's exports, because of the fact that we are so self-sufficient, the United States is producing cash crops and not just something to sustain the United States, but enough to trade. So our exports have almost tripled in the past 100 years. And we really had this belief in the form of government that we had, and there was still this deep respect and dignity of the individual along with the government. There was a trust which hadn't quite been broken yet, which we'll get into that later as we progress. So this is called the Progressive Era, and we're going to see how far we get through all of these years in this lecture. Be sure you have your handout that you got on our face-to-face time so that you can have all of the questions to answer, or the blanks to fill in, so that you can have that ready to go to turn in, and then you have a question sheet. Answer those questions. You can do them as you're going if you want, so that way you have them for your homework. Let's talk for a minute about Henry Ford. So the most dynamic change in American transportation in the earliest 20th century was the improvement of the automobile. You have horse-drawn carriages. They're still very dominant on the roads around the turn of the century, but we soon have this thing that was called the horseless carriage. The automobile was beginning to really make its mark in the early 1900s. In 1895, there were 4 registered automobiles in the United States, just 4. By 1900, there were 8,000. So 4 people owned cars in registered owned cars in 1895. In just 5 years to 1900, there were 8,000. By 1920, there were more than 8 million. And then by 1940, there were 27 million, and it just grows. So Henry Ford is really the one who revolutionized transportation more than any of these other people. Again, automobiles were around. He didn't invent the automobile. He didn't invent the assembly line. But he had this dream that regular people would be able to afford vehicles or automobiles. The problem was making an automobile pre-Henry Ford took a very, very long time, and therefore you had to pay your employees more, right? And so therefore the product cost more. And Henry Ford had a dream that he could lower the cost. And so a lot of people say he invented the assembly line. The reality is he didn't invent the assembly line. And actually his first car in 1809, he introduced, that should be 1908. He introduced, I don't know how it has my 9 and 8 are inverted. This should be 1908, not 1809. In 1908, he introduced the Model T, and the reality is it was an expensive vehicle. It wasn't one of the inexpensive ones he had dreamed about. In 1913, so 5-ish years later, right? So from 1908, 4-ish years later, 1908, 5 years to 1913, he engineered an automobile assembly line. Again, he didn't invent the assembly line. It wasn't a new idea. And what happened was, because he was able to perfect this idea of the assembly line in the production of vehicles, it dramatically increases the speed of production. Therefore, it cuts the cost of production. And now, because of this perfected assembly line, Henry Ford is able to produce low cost but still dependable cars, and this skyrockets the sale of vehicles and regular people being able to afford vehicles. And it just sort of continues on and on and on as this idea of the assembly line and quicker ways of making things hits the scene. Another big jump in the early 20th century was air travel. Air travel was born, or sort of was, yeah, air travel was born in the early 20th century when two guys, Wilbur and Orville Wright, made their first successful powered flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17th, 1903. These guys had been, they were owners of a bicycle shop. They had really been experimenting, and they weren't the only ones at this time. There were several who were experimenting with this study of flight and trying to figure out a way to fly. And really, Leonardo da Vinci, if you go all the way back, had sketches of flying machines. So it wasn't necessarily a new idea. It was just that these guys were able to really perfect it quicker than anyone else. They had experimented for about 6 years. The Wright brothers, because of this, they're adding to and they're correcting scientific knowledge that had already been about. And the reality is very few people took this idea seriously until about 1903. But they were able to have that first flight. It wasn't very long, and if we were meeting together, we would watch this short little clip of Charlie Brown, actually, with them on this first flight. It's pretty cute. The reality is, airplanes weren't really put massively into effect until World War I. Effectively, they were being used, but World War I really saw them become a very effective tool for the world. So, Wilbur and Orville Wright. In 1896, which is a little bit earlier than this, but 1896, you have the wireless telegraph system by an Italian scientist. Americans are soon using these principles of wireless telegraph to good use. I can't even wrap my head around wireless telephones and wireless telegraphs, but of course you have the telegraph. That instantly leads to the wireless telephone. Speech was successfully transmitted across the Atlantic by wireless telephone in 1915, and I cannot wrap my head around how that works. Like, I understand on paper how it works, but the reality of it I don't get. I don't understand text messaging. I don't understand any of this wireless stuff. It's pretty cool. In 1915, New York and San Francisco were connected by the first transcontinental long-distance telephone service, which really changed so much of the way that people were able to keep in contact with each other and the ability to communicate literally across across the world. So that was a big deal. Now, one of the biggest stories in the newspapers of the earliest 20th century was the sinking of the Titanic. It sunk on April 14th, 1912, and you've probably heard of all of these things of the Titanic. It really was a terrible story. I shouldn't say story, because story sort of suggests that it was not a true story, but the Titanic set sail. It was this giant, luxurious ship. It was the largest one at the time that had ever been built. And it was called the Unsinkable Titanic. It was supposed to be unsinkable anyway. And ideally, this huge vessel was designed to stay afloat with 4 holds flooded, which means in the bottom of the boat they have these sections. And supposedly 4 of these guys the sections could fill up and still stay afloat, which is a lot of water for a ship to take on. And there's all these theories about why it sunk and that it shouldn't have ever sunk. But the worst part about it is the usage of the oh my gosh, boats that you use when you're sinking. My brain just totally shut down. They were not filling up the boats that they were supposed to be getting off of. And I'll be honest, I hate the movie. I absolutely hate the movie Titanic. It is one of my most hated movies of all time. However, it is a pretty good depiction of what was happening while it was floating. If you look at the boats in that movie, there's these huge boats that can hold like 68 people or something ridiculous, and they're putting like 12 people on it. And so there was a whole lot of unnecessary deaths. And I am a pretty big conspiracy theorist, but I think that there are many issues with this story of the Titanic sinking, and it shouldn't have happened. But the reality is, regardless of that, regardless of the ship not being built correctly, regardless of the guy who was on watch not having his binoculars and not having his whistle, and there's another theory that they were warned there were icebergs and that they just ignored the telegraph. There's so many issues, but the real problem is the fact that they did not use the lifeboats. There was not even enough lifeboats on the boat, first of all, because they didn't look pretty according to the captain or the designer. So they took a whole lot of them off. There weren't even enough lifeboats on the boat to save the passengers. And then those that were being let down were not being filled to capacity. And so there was a huge amount of people who died who were unnecessary. There was 1,522 men, women, and children died. 1,522. And I used to know the number, but it should have been way less than that if they had used those lifeboats correctly. And it shouldn't have been any of them if they had had the appropriate number of lifeboats. And I think for me, that's the part that angers me the most about the Titanic. So, April 14th, 1912, the Titanic sinks and really shook the whole world. The next guy I want to talk about is President Theodore Roosevelt. So in 1901, William McKinley, who was president, who just elected to the second term, was shot by this like deranged anarchist, and McKinley died on September 14th, 1901. This makes him the third president to be assassinated and the fifth president to die in office. His vice president is Theodore Roosevelt. He then, on the same day, takes the presidential oath, and at the age of 42, Roosevelt was the youngest man to ever become president. Now, John F. Kennedy becomes the youngest president ever elected. Kennedy was 43, Roosevelt's 42, but Roosevelt was technically never elected as president. So he becomes the youngest man to ever become president. Theodore was known, kind of this affectionate nickname, as Teddy Roosevelt. And a lot of scholars will say that he was the most popular president of the early 1900s. He had a huge myriad of talents and abilities. He is an accomplished scholar. He was a writer. He loved to ride horses. He was a hunter. He loved to hike. He loved to box. He really encouraged what he called the strenuous life. You read his history and he's out facing lions in Africa, and then he's coming head to head with these massive corrupt politicians in the United States. Born in 1858, he really has this massively rich family heritage when it comes to politics. He was related by blood or marriage to 9 other men who became president: John Adams, James Madison, John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, Benjamin Harrison, William Howard Taft, and Franklin Roosevelt. He's also related to Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, and Robert E. Lee. So he is related to a whole lot of political people. He suffered as a child with nearsightedness and asthma, and as an adult he still wore glasses, but he believed through this vigorous exercise program that he conquered his asthma, and he really built up this really unusual physical strength and endurance through just physically getting out and working hard. He was kind of homeschooled because of his ill health. He goes to Harvard. He graduates and spends a small time at law school, doesn't make it there, or doesn't stay there. He writes his first book called The Naval War of 1812. He was very highly respected in the political arena. He had a wife who died 2 days after giving birth to their only daughter, and really kind of to escape his grief, he left politics. He bought 2 cattle ranches in the Dakota Territory, and during this time period, He proves himself as this very skilled cowboy. In 1886, he returns to the East, where he eventually remarries, and he starts back up his political career. He became known, very famous in the Spanish-American War, as leading what they called the Rough Riders. And then he becomes the vice president under McKinley, who then is assassinated. Now, when he was sort of thrust into the presidency, he took up these duties with his same vigor and enthusiasm that he had done everything else in his life. On the domestic scene, on the inside scene at home, he stood for honesty in business, wisdom in conserving our natural resources, and what he called the square deal for all Americans. When it came to his regard for foreign policy, basically what that means is dealing with non-American countries, he really strove for peace. He wanted peace, but at the same time, he built up this strong defense system in preparation for war if we needed it. And it's interesting, not interesting, but just kind of cute. After, on his way out of the presidency, he made a famous quote that he said, "I do not believe that anyone else has ever enjoyed the White House as much as I have." And he really made a lot of good decisions during this time period that made quite a bit of changes during his presidency. We'll talk about a few of those in just a sec. A couple of things I want to point out during this time period. You have this guy named Upton Sinclair, and he writes a book in 1906 called The Jungle. And he actually, from what I remember, and I haven't studied this in quite a long time, but he was totally appalled by the working conditions in the meat packing houses in Chicago. Now, I'll be honest, walking into a meat packing house, I don't even want to visualize it, but he was appalled at the conditions of the people. And he wrote this book called The Jungle with the intent of bringing to the forefront the understanding of how bad people were being treated who were working for these meat packing houses. Long hour, anyway, it was really terrible conditions for the people who were working there. And while this book had a major effect, it really didn't have the effect that Upton Sinclair had intended. The reality is people began to read this book called The Jungle, and they were absolutely appalled by the processes that were happening in the meat packing houses. And while he intended for people to become aware of the mistreatment of humans, those who were reading began to be aware of the type of meat they were eating and the fact that it wasn't being cared for and the fact that it wasn't being treated the way it should be, and that it's hanging in the fly-infested areas and it's rotting, and they're selling the meat to people and they were eating it. And it really had this catalyst to your readers were more captivated by the account of the unhealthy practices than it was by the people. And so what happens is we end up with a whole bunch of policies being put in place because of this. And there's a quote by Upton Sinclair. He said, "I aimed at the public's heart and by accident hit it in the stomach." And we're going to see in a few minutes several acts that were put in place that were a direct reaction from this book that was written. So in 1906, after the book is published, Congress adopts what's called the Meat Inspection Act. And I'm not a huge advocate for the government being in charge of a lot of things. I think we need a government and they need to be in charge of things, but this is something that I am very grateful that the government has some power over. It's called the Meat Inspection Act, which granted federal authorities the power to inspect all meat shipped in interstate commerce to see that it did not come from diseased animals and that it was processed and packaged under sanitary conditions. I mean, guys, they were buying, they'd go to the slaughterhouses or to the meat that was coming into the slaughterhouses were just being bought off of these ranchers, and the ranchers were like, "Oh, here's a good healthy cow for, $50. Here's a sickly cow for $5." And they'd buy the sick ones, process them, and then sell the meat. So it was, I don't even think about eating that meat. But this Meat Inspection Act really helped with making sure that the meat that's being sold is processed correctly and is healthy. The same year, Congress passed what's called the Pure Food and Drug Act, which sort of has the same idea, is that it was designed to prevent the manufacture and sale of adulterated food and drugs. So this went into other things besides just the meat packing, just to make sure that all of the things that were being allowed to be sold were uncorrupted, where they were being produced in a way that was healthy. Now, one of Teddy Roosevelt's most lasting contributions to his country, he really stood for conservation of land, right? And so he kind of awakened people to the need for consistent and well-defined conservation programs, conserving natural resources. You have Mount Rainier National Park is put into place. You have the Roosevelt Dam you put in place, and all of these different national parks to conserve and to take care of the land that the Americans were blessed with. All right, August of 1914, the Panama Canal was opened for use, and so early on in American exploration, or the New World exploration, people were convinced that there was a water route through this giant amount of land, and the reality is there wasn't. And so during the Spanish-American War, there really became an awareness of needing a water route to cut through this massive amount of land. It was 14,000 miles, this trip called the Battleship Oregon, leaves the California coast, has to go all the way down around the tip of South America in order to get to the Caribbean Ocean, or the Caribbean area, and it was a 14,000 mile trip. And all of a sudden people were like, this is ridiculous, we've got to figure out a way to do it. And so we found this land that there was already some construction happening that a French company owned, and I'm going to do a very condensed story of this. A French company owned it. They were plagued by this terrible management, but worse than that, tropical diseases, mosquitoes, and all of these issues that the French were not used to. So they sell this huge portion of land. We have some treaties built up. We're granted through these different treaties. I think it's a 10-mile wide section of land. Ultimately, what we now have is the Panama Canal. It's constructed of these series of locks and gates that open and shut and go up and down. That's pretty cool if you want to Google a video of how it works. And in August of 1914, the Panama Canal is opened for use just in time for World War I. Construction costs for the United States totaled nearly $400 million, but it shortened the distance from New York to San Francisco by water by this huge amount, and it absolutely shifted the way the entire Navy could get from one ocean to the other, which becomes paramount in the upcoming wars. In regard to foreign affairs, so dealing with outside sources, Teddy Roosevelt summarized his kind of general policy with this slogan: speak softly and carry a big stick. Which sounds kind of strange, but basically he promoted peace. He wanted us to live peacefully with other nations, to speak softly with other nations, but wanted let aggressors know that the United States was prepared and willing to fight if necessary. This big stick policy was demonstrated several times in his presidency. So, example, at the close of the Spanish-American War, the United States was obligated or put into position to protect Puerto Rico, which had become the possession of the United States, and Cuba, which had become a protectorate of us. So the opening of the Panama Canal would soon make this Caribbean Sea a highway of international commerce. People would be going back and forth, and it would become increasingly important to promote peace, to maintain a stable government in the Caribbean. Teddy Roosevelt intended to look after the best interests of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. That was his whole goal, was to protect the United States and have the best interest at hand. Now, an example, in 1902, Venezuela was controlled by this dictator who absolutely refused to honor the debts that the nation had to several European powers. Great Britain and Germany broke off diplomatic relations with Venezuela, and they they put into place a blockade of the ports. So basically, Germany and Great Britain blocked off the ports in and out of Venezuela. Germany went so far as to sink Venezuelan gunboats, therefore killing, I'm sure, some of their citizens, and they even bombarded one of the coastal towns. When the United States asked Germany and Great Britain to sort of, it's called arbitration, to let another group come in and help maintain the peace as a outside source, Great Britain agreed to cooperate. Germany refused. This made Americans a little bit nervous because Germany is taking, kind of an enemy state is taking possession of some area. And so when Germany refused, Roosevelt unofficially, warned the German ambassador that he would send the U.S. fleet to Venezuela unless Germany agreed, and eventually Germany complied. And the thought was that in those waters, it is our job to protect our protectorates, not that we're stepping on the toes of other countries, but that those other countries are sort of getting into our space and that there is a safety net that is being messed with. And as long as they stay in their space, we're going to speak softly, but when it becomes a problem, we're going to carry a big stick. So speak softly and carry a big stick. There's also this thing called the open door policy we need to talk about. When Theodore Roosevelt became president, again in 1901, there were some pretty recent, at that time, events happening in the Far East that put the United States in a pretty important role in that part of the world. We had gained control of the Philippines and of some coaling stations, coal-like, C-O-A-L, coaling stations in the Pacific. And this increased the American interest in the Far East because of some land that we were in control of, especially the events happening in China. And at the time, things in China were very chaotic. There was a war in 1894 to 1895, in which Japan easily defeated China. And then the powers of Europe, mostly Russia and Germany, moved in to take control of some leased land in some Chinese ports. So China had some ports that European countries, specifically at this time, Russia and Germany, had kind of like leased the land from China. And so when Japan came in and defeated China, Russia and Germany quickly moved in to take control of those Chinese ports. And the concern was that as those major powers began to take control of these small ports, they would then try to begin to take over more land and a giant war would happen. So the nations carved out what they called these spheres of influence along China's coast. They're controlling these economic affairs and then this trade with the outside world. Many Americans became disturbed, I guess is probably the best word, about China kind of being dissected by these European powers. Christians were concerned because there were some missionary opportunities that were being interfered with. Businessmen began to be fearful because of the trade with China was going to be hampered. In 1899, the Secretary of State, his name was John Hay, sent what we call open door notes to the European powers and to Japan, asking that each nation agree not to interfere with the trade rights of other nations. So we sent this note not telling them that we're going to come take them out. Remember, we're speaking softly, but asking them, you know what, you do what you want with your area. You're in this port, you take control, whatever, but we're asking you not to interfere with the trade of the other countries so that we can keep trade going. We cannot interrupt all of these things. We also, in that policy, began to ask to not discriminate against certain groups of people. And he requested that the powers respect certain Chinese rights. There was a concern that they were going to march in and completely do away with these very ancient and very important Chinese rights. And that's why it's called open door. Basically, he asked various powers to maintain an open door in China, that the door would be opened to maintain the relationships with other people. Now, this works, and basically the open door policy becomes an effective policy in keeping the peace in this area. So things are back to being peaceful in China, which of course, if you study history, know that peace doesn't usually last very long. So just a few months after John Hay announced the open door policy being an effective policy in China, new trouble flares up in China. You have this super patriotic band of Chinese, they're called nationalists. They call themselves Boxers. Well, no, the Westerners, they don't call themselves Boxers. Westerners, so those living in the Western Hemisphere, call them Boxers because of this boxing and certain rituals that they practiced. They begin to rebel against the influence of Western civilization in China. So as these European powers are coming in, this group of people, again, we call them the Boxers, are afraid that they're going to come in and do away with all of their cultural and very important rituals and religion and all of those things. And so this group of Boxers rebels against this idea of the Westerners and the influence by the Western nations. So they make this vow. They're going to drive out what they call the foreign devils from their nation. And this hatred of rebels was really directed at all aspects of Western civilization, even those who are living peacefully. But one of the groups that really begins to be hit big are the Christians, because they are coming in and teaching a brand new religion, and a religion has so many effects to so many aspects of your life that this became one of the massive groups of people that were being not prosecuted, but persecuted by the Boxers. And a lot of it was because they were afraid it was going to sort of undermine what we would call pagan beliefs in their society. The Boxers, aided by the Chinese government authorities, begin to attack foreigners. They ultimately murder over 200 Westerners. A whole lot of them were American and European missionaries, so that they were not there to make a money issues. It was all this, not all of them, but a very large portion of them were there peacefully trying to just spread their belief system. All Christian missionaries in China suffered, but the greatest number of people killed were with these two specific groups. There was one famous guy, his name is Jonathan Goforth, who was a missionary from Canada. Anyway, it was this very big, ugly, messy thing. Ultimately, the Boxers took control of the area around the capital that we now call Beijing. It was Peking then. They began to drive out surviving foreigners into their areas that are headquarters for their foreign diplomats. The leading nations then sent an international rescue force, which includes about 2,500 American troops, to put down this Boxer rebellion. And again, we need to look at this. We're not just marching into China with our troops just because. We're there to protect the interests. Again, we're going to speak softly, but carry a big stick. We're not going to mess with you, but the moment that you begin to interfere with American interests, at that point America is going to step in, and that's what we did. We sent in, along with other other European nations, troops to put down the Boxer Rebellion. At the end of things, there were this very angry group of foreign powers, and they just decide they're going to force China to pay for what we now call the Boxer Rebellion. Now, there was this concern that the European powers would use this incident as a jumping off point for seizing more power in China. There was this concern that these European powers were going to come in and just take over all of China. John Hay, again the Secretary of State for the United States, sends a series of what he calls open door notes, proclaiming that the United States intended to maintain the integrity of China, that as this power, our intent is to maintain the integrity of China. And so in the end, Hay's wishes are followed. They don't come in and begin to just dissect China and begin to take over the territory. But European nations did force China to pay in a total of $333 million, 24.5 million of that China paid to the United States, which the reality is, from what I understand, it far exceeded the amount required to pay for the losses. But that was what they paid us, and from what I understand, the United States actually returned more than half of that money to the Chinese government because it was way more than what we needed. So what I've read is that in appreciation of that, the Chinese officials set aside that money to pay for educating certain Chinese students, many of whom were then sent to the United States. And the reality is, from what I've read, those scholars really ended up playing a pretty important role in westernizing that area, which not everyone views as a good thing, but that's another conversation for another time. So there's the Boxer Rebellion. That, again, this idea of speak softly and carry a big stick really worked in keeping the peace and avoiding what would have been a world war, most likely. President Roosevelt's kind of first experience at dealing with problems in the Far East came in 1904 with Japan, or when Japan, angered by Russia's expansion into Manchuria. So there was this northeastern part of China called Manchuria, and Japan got really angry because Russia was expanding their part of their land in there. So then they declare war on Russia. So Japan declares war on Russia because Russia is trying to expand its territory into China, and if you look at a map, they're real close to each other, right? So Japan gets concerned. Japan sort of deals the Russian Navy this devastating blow, and they win a series of land battles. But the problem is Japan didn't have enough finances or the manpower for this long, drawn-out war. So Japanese officials kind of reach out to let President Roosevelt know that an offer from the United States to negotiate a peace settlement would be well received. They don't really want the world to know that they're going to the United States to ask for help, but hey, if you offer help, we will go along with the peace treaty. So President Roosevelt realizes then that if this is what we call the Russo-Japanese War, if it's allowed to drag on until one power absolutely defeats the other power, that disruption of power would upset that balance over there for the power in the Far East, and would eventually hurt American missionary interests in China and the American commercial interests in China. So because of that long-term effect of hurting American industry or interest there, September 1905, President Roosevelt calls some representatives in from Russia and Japan to a peace conference in New Hampshire. While they're there, the two powers sign a peace treaty in which Japan replaces Russia as the dominant foreign power in Manchuria and strengthens then her position in Korea. In addition to that, Russia ceded to Japan the southern half of some islands that are there. And ultimately, because of his ability to keep peace here, Roosevelt is actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize of 1906. You should have a handout from face-to-face time on Tuesday. You need to go through, if you can answer all those questions on that worksheet, but then I want you to submit those answers online. There is, in order to make my life more contained, I need you guys to follow the link that was attached to the assignment here and answer those questions. The questions are straight from the handout, so what you can do is use the handout, answer those questions, and then answer them online on the link to the online quiz.